When I think about my childhood, I'm immediately flooded with memories of laughter echoing down sunlit hallways, the scent of my mom's vanilla candles burning softly in the evenings, and my dad's boisterous jokes that could turn even the dullest day into an adventure. My name is Sarah, I'm 27 years old now, but those early years growing up in the suburbs were nothing short of magical. My parents, Michael and Linda, weren't wealthy, not by any stretch. Dad worked as a mechanic, always coming home with grease stains on his hands and a grin on his face, while Mom worked part-time at the local library, somehow finding the energy to read bedtime stories with so much animation you'd think she was on Broadway. Money was tight, but thanks to my grandparents, Elizabeth and George, we never truly felt the weight of it. They lived a few towns over in a grand old Victorian house and helped with finances whenever things got rough. I grew up in a modest three-bedroom home with peeling white paint and a creaky front porch that served as the stage for countless childhood plays and lemonade stands. Our backyard was a jungle in my eyes, with a twisted oak tree that stood like a giant, its heavy branches my escape into 1,000 imagined worlds. Besides my parents and grandparents, there was our neighbor, Mr. Dutton, a wiry old man who smelled of pipe tobacco and claimed he'd once been a spy. I believed him completely. His backyard was filled with all sorts of odd trinkets, rusted weather vanes, broken typewriters, even a mannequin missing an eye, and he'd spin incredible tales about each one. He gave me my first spy mission when I was 7, to deliver a secret note, a scribbled smiley face, to his cat Marbles without being seen. Then there was Ellie and Tom, the twins who lived 2 houses down. They were a year older than me and absolutely fearless. It was because of them that I learned how to climb the rickety fence behind Mr. Dutton's yard, despite the risk of splinters and the one time I got my shirt caught and had to dangle like an idiot until someone heard my screaming. Their parents, Susan and Gary, were always fighting, screaming so loudly we could hear it even during our games. Ellie once said casually that they only stayed together because divorce is expensive, a sentence that stuck with me for reasons I couldn't fully understand at the time. One summer evening, everything shifted in a way I didn't expect. My mom's younger brother, Uncle Darren, showed up at our house with a suitcase and a black eye. I had barely seen him before, only at rare Christmases or birthdays. He moved into our spare room without much explanation, though I overheard enough whispered arguments between Mom and Dad to realize he was trouble. Darren was loud, smelled of stale beer, and sometimes got so angry playing video games in the living room that he smashed the controller against the wall. But he also had moments of strange kindness, like building me a tire swing in the backyard or buying me a giant teddy bear from the carnival. It was Darren who introduced me to Becky, a girl from across town who was 12 and already had a tongue piercing. Becky fascinated and scared me all at once. She taught me how to make prank calls and once dared me to shoplift a pack of gum from the local gas station. I chickened out at the last second and dropped the gum on the floor before running out red-faced. Becky laughed so hard she almost choked. Looking back, that was the first crack in the perfect shell of my childhood. There was the night our dog Max disappeared. He was a shaggy mutt with floppy ears and a bark that sounded like a broken trumpet. One minute he was chasing a raccoon through the yard, and the next he was just gone. We spent days posting flyers, knocking on doors, driving around the neighborhoods. Grandpa George even offered a reward. A week later, Mr. Dutton found Max's collar tangled in the bushes by the old railway tracks, but there was no sign of Max. Mom cried for 3 straight nights, and Dad stopped telling his jokes for a while. Grandma Elizabeth tried to soothe me by teaching me to bake banana bread, her thin fingers expertly mixing and kneading, her silver hair always tied back in a neat bun. She told me stories about her own childhood during the war, about ration books and hiding in bomb shelters, stories so vivid they made my own troubles seem small. But not everything could be fixed with baking and bedtime stories. One Saturday morning, we woke up to find that Darren had stolen Dad's truck and emptied Mom's purse. He was gone without a trace. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the half-eaten bowl of cereal in front of me, while Mom sat stone-faced and Dad paced the room in furious silence. It was the first time I saw him punch the wall so hard it left a dent. The police came and went, but Darren was never found. Grandpa George tried to convince Dad to press charges, but in the end, they didn't. Family, Mom said in a voice so brittle it sounded like it would break apart. After Darren's betrayal, things at home grew strained. Dad worked longer hours, Mom stopped reading bedtime stories as often, and I found myself spending more time with Ellie, Tom, and even Mr. Dutton, who started teaching me how to pick locks, just for fun. I could open a padlock with a hairpin by the time I was 8, a skill I kept hidden like a treasure. It wasn't all bad, though. There were still weekends when Grandpa George and Grandma Elizabeth would swoop in and whisk me off to their house, where the rules were looser and the fridge was always stocked with soda and ice cream. Grandma let me wear her jewelry and clomp around the house in her high heels, while Grandpa taught me how to drive his old tractor around the backyard. I felt invincible there, like nothing could touch me, but shadows kept creeping in. One evening, just after my 9th birthday, I caught Mr. Dutton burying something in his backyard under the full moon. When he realized I was watching, he just smiled and said, "A spy must always have secrets, kiddo." I never found out what it was, but sometimes I wondered if he was burying more than just memories. Then came the house fire. It started in the middle of the night, a faulty heater sparking in the laundry room. I woke up to thick smoke and Dad shouting for everyone to get out. We barely made it. The fire department said we were lucky to be alive. Half the house was destroyed, and we had to move in with Grandma and Grandpa for nearly a year while repairs were made. That year was a strange mix of cramped quarters, whispered arguments behind closed doors, and moments of fierce, stubborn love that made everything else bearable. During that time, my world kept expanding in ways I couldn't control. Becky got arrested for shoplifting. Ellie's parents finally divorced, and Tom moved away with their dad. Mr. Dutton disappeared one day, leaving behind an empty house and a mailbox stuffed with unpaid bills. By the time we moved back into our repaired home, I wasn't a little kid anymore. I understood that even the happiest childhoods had cracks, places where the light didn't always reach. But I was lucky too. I had my parents, who despite everything never stopped loving me, and my grandparents, who taught me that family wasn't just about blood, it was about showing up, even when things got messy. I didn't know it then, but the wild, joyful, chaotic years of my early life had built the foundation for everything that would come after. And even as the cracks widened, even as the shadows grew longer, there was always some part of me that held onto that backyard oak tree, those summer nights chasing fireflies, and the feeling that I was, in spite of everything, safe and loved. I always knew there was a kind of invisible wall between my parents and my grandparents, but as I got older, I realized just how thick and heavy that wall had become. It started around the time I was accepted into Westbridge Academy, a private school that looked like something out of a movie. It had manicured lawns, massive stone buildings, and kids who showed up in black sedans with drivers. There was no way my parents could afford it on their own. The tuition alone was more than what Dad made in a year. So, of course, Grandma Elizabeth and Grandpa George stepped in. They wrote the checks without blinking, bought me the uniform, even paid for the violin lessons that Westbridge insisted were highly recommended. At first, I thought it was a good thing. I mean, what kid wouldn't? Private school meant I got to wear those cute plaid skirts, carry a designer backpack, and tell people I went to the same school some minor celebrities' kid attended. But it didn't take long before I started noticing how tense things became at home. Dad would come home from work, slamming the door harder than necessary. Mom would pretend she was busy, wiping down counters that were already clean or reorganizing the fridge for the third time that week. They didn't fight loudly, but the silence between them was sharp enough to cut. One night, I overheard them whisper fighting in the kitchen while they thought I was asleep. "I don't want their charity," Dad hissed. "It's not charity, Michael. It's their granddaughter," Mom snapped back. "Yeah, feels more like they're buying her." I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling something sour pool in my stomach. The tension only got worse when Grandma Elizabeth bought me a car for my 16th birthday. Not just any car, a brand new silver BMW with a red bow on top. Dad refused to even come outside when they presented it to me in the driveway. I remember gripping the keys, my hands sweating, caught between feeling ecstatic and horribly guilty. Grandpa George chuckled and clapped me on the back. "You're our little princess, Sarah. Only the best." That night, Dad sat at the kitchen table long after everyone had gone to bed, just nursing a beer and staring at nothing. I wanted to say something, to tell him I didn't care about the car, that I still loved him even if he couldn't buy me fancy things. But I didn't know how. Around this time, new faces started entering my life. There was Cassie, my roommate from Westbridge, who came from old money and thought nothing of dropping $500 on a pair of shoes. Her mother, Veronica, was a socialite who invited me to their house parties where waiters in bow ties served shrimp cocktail. Cassie once said, laughing, "Sarah, your grandparents must really love you. It's like you won the lottery." Her words stuck to me like glue. Things got even worse when my parents started refusing the gifts. Grandma and Grandpa bought us a new dishwasher after ours broke down, and Dad sent it back. They tried to pay for a family vacation to Hawaii, and Mom turned them down, her lips thin and tight. There was this constant tug of war, me caught right in the middle. One afternoon, during what was supposed to be a family dinner at Grandma and Grandpa's, it all exploded. Grandma made some comment about how she wished Mom would dress me better, maybe take me shopping more often. Mom froze, fork halfway to her mouth. Dad set down his glass with a thud. "You know, Elizabeth," Dad said, his voice deceptively calm, "we're doing just fine raising our daughter without your damn money." The room went dead silent. I wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. Grandpa George cleared his throat. "We're only trying to help." "Yeah. Well, it doesn't feel like help," Dad said. "It feels like you're trying to replace us." That night, we drove home in silence. I stared out the window at the blur of streetlights, feeling like everything inside me was breaking apart. To make matters worse, Grandma Elizabeth didn't take Dad's outburst lightly. Over the next few months, she started sending things directly to me instead of the house. Packages would show up at school, gift cards, expensive jewelry, designer clothes. I hid most of it in my locker, too afraid to bring it home. Around this time, another figure stepped into the chaos. Principal Hawthorne, a stern woman with sharp eyes, who pulled me into her office one day to talk about my unique circumstances. She said things like, "It's important you understand who's invested in your future, and opportunities like this don't happen for just anyone." I sat there nodding, not really understanding until later that Grandma and Grandpa had made a hefty donation to the school in my name. When I told Mom about it, she went very quiet. Dad left the house and didn't come back until after midnight. I guess that was when it really clicked for me. My life wasn't entirely mine anymore. I was a project, an investment. And everyone had their own idea of what I was supposed to become. Still, life at Westbridge moved fast. Between classes, violin lessons, SAT prep, and the endless social events Cassie dragged me to, I barely had time to breathe. I also met Mason, a boy 2 years older, who had a tattoo on his wrist and a smile that made my knees weak. He wasn't from Westbridge. He worked at a coffee shop nearby and smelled like cinnamon and smoke. Mason saw right through the polished exterior. "You're not like them," he said once, brushing a stray hair from my face. "You're real." It was the most intoxicating thing anyone had ever said to me. Of course, when Grandma Elizabeth found out about him, she lost it. She called him a distraction, a bad influence, and even offered to pay for a summer program abroad to get me away from him. I didn't go. I couldn't. Instead, I started sneaking out to see Mason, lying to my parents, lying to everyone. For a while, it felt thrilling, like I was taking my life back. But secrets pile up fast, and it wasn't long before everything started crashing down. One night, Mason and I were driving back from a concert when a cop pulled us over. Mason had been drinking, just a little, but enough. He got arrested. I wasn't charged, but the whole thing made it into the town gossip mill. Grandma Elizabeth stormed into our house the next morning, demanding that I be pulled from Westbridge immediately, that Mason be forbidden from seeing me again, that something be done before I threw my life away. Mom cried. Dad yelled. Grandpa George tried to calm everyone down, but it was no use. The house felt like it was imploding. That night, Mom sat on the edge of my bed, her eyes red-rimmed. We just want you to be happy, Sarah. But sometimes it feels like we're losing you. I didn't ask for any of this, I whispered. She reached out, touched my cheek, and in that moment I saw how exhausted she was. Not just tired, but worn down by years of tension, of feeling like she could never quite measure up. After the arrest, everything changed. Grandma and Grandpa stopped visiting as often. The gifts slowed to a trickle. I finished out the year at Westbridge but skipped graduation. I didn't want to hear the speeches, the forced congratulations. I just wanted out. I thought maybe things would settle after that, but I was wrong. The final straw came 6 months later, when Grandpa George had a stroke. It was mild, but it rattled everyone. We gathered at the hospital, awkward and tense. Grandma Elizabeth barely spoke to my parents, communicating through clipped nods and cold stares. When Grandpa was finally discharged, he asked to see me alone. I sat beside him in the sterile hospital room, listening to the soft beep of machines. Don't let the money change you, he said, his voice rough. And don't let them fight over you, like you're a prize to be won. I didn't know how to answer. I just held his hand and cried. From that point on, the family fractured completely. Holidays were split. Phone calls became rare and strained. I tried to bridge the gap sometimes, but it always ended in bitterness. Looking back, I realized that the love was always real, but so were the resentments, the expectations, the silent wars fought over who got to shape my future. And in the end, no one really won. By the time I turned 15, it felt like my life was being pulled in two different directions, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't hold both ends together. Grandma Elizabeth and Grandpa George, never subtle about their intentions, had begun signing me up for every prestigious summer camp they could find. Leadership camps, creative writing camps, business entrepreneur boot camps. It didn't matter if I was interested or not. If it sounded impressive on a college application, they wanted me there. My first summer at Camp Redstone was supposed to shape the leaders of tomorrow, according to the glossy brochure. In reality, it was 6 weeks of high-strung teenagers competing for the attention of celebrity guest speakers, most of whom were failed tech CEOs or motivational speakers that looked dead inside. I didn't fit in. Everyone was busy handing out LinkedIn connections like candy, and I was just there, feeling like I was wearing someone else's skin. I called my mom one night from the camp payphone, trying to hide how miserable I was. Maybe try to have a better attitude, she said, her voice distant, distracted. I heard dishes clinking in the background, the faint drone of the TV. Can't I come home early? I asked. There was a long pause. You need to finish what you started, she said flatly. Your grandparents paid good money for that camp. I hung up feeling smaller than ever. When I got back at the end of August, thinner and angrier than I'd left, I found that my room had been remodeled. Without asking me. New furniture, new paint, a pale, sterile blue. My old posters were gone. So were my stuffed animals, packed away in the attic like they were something to be ashamed of. Surprise! Grandma Elizabeth said brightly. You're growing up, Mom added with a tight smile. It didn't feel like a gift. It felt like I'd been evicted from my own life. At school, the rift between me and the other kids had widened. Most of them spent their summers working part-time jobs or lounging at the local pool, not collecting certificates from overpriced camps. I tried telling stories about Camp Redstone, but no one cared. I stopped trying pretty fast. Around then, new people started to appear in my life, friends of Grandma and Grandpa. There was Mrs. Pendleton, a retired judge who invited me to lunch at her country club, and Mr. Stratton, a business owner who kept dropping hints about internship opportunities, even though I was still in high school. They treated me like a little investment project they could mentor into some perfect future adult. Meanwhile, back at home, things kept freezing over. Dad, who used to make cheesy jokes and pull faces at the dinner table to make me laugh, now barely spoke to me unless he had to. Mom, once so warm and silly, treated me like a distant guest. Conversations became stiff, formal. How was your day? Fine. Good. Then silence. It all came to a head on my 16th birthday. I wasn't expecting much, maybe a cake, maybe a few friends over. But when I came home from school, there it was, a brand new Lexus parked in the driveway, a giant red bow slapped on the hood like a cherry on top of a sundae. I froze. I didn't know what to feel. Excitement? Fear? Grandpa George beamed proudly. You deserve it, sweetheart. Dad stood behind them, arms crossed, his mouth a flat, Grim line. Mom didn't say anything at all. I barely remember the rest of that afternoon. There were photos, of course. Grandma insisting I pose behind the wheel, Dad lingering just out of frame like he couldn't bear to be part of it. Later that night, I found him sitting in the garage, staring at his old Ford pickup. "Do you even want that car?" he asked, not looking at me. "I don't know," I said. "It's just there." He laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "Yeah, that's about right." I wanted to tell him that I would have been happy with anything he gave me. A beat-up used car. A keychain with my initials on it. Anything that came from him. But the words stuck in my throat. It didn't take long before the Lexus became just another wedge between us. Dad refused to let me park it in the driveway next to his truck. I had to park it down the street. At Westbridge, though, the Lexus made me instantly more interesting. Kids who'd barely glanced at me before now wanted rides to the mall, to parties, anywhere. I met Daniel this way, a senior with green eyes, a quick smile, and a terrible reputation. Daniel lived fast. He raced cars on the old county roads, crashed house parties without invitations, and somehow managed to charm every adult he met. Dating him was like being strapped to a rocket with no brakes. I was terrified. I was alive. Of course, Daniel didn't care about my grades or the summer camps or the future my grandparents were building brick by brick around me. He liked that I had access to a Lexus and parents too distracted to notice where I was half the time. One night, after a party that got out of hand, Daniel dared me to drive the Lexus down Quarry Road, a twisting, barely lit strip of asphalt known for accidents. I said no at first. I wasn't drunk, but Daniel was, and he was laughing so hard tears streamed down his face. "Come on, princess," he slurred. "You're not scared, are you?" The word princess snapped something inside me. It sounded too much like Grandpa George. Too much like the version of me everyone else had invented. So I drove. I shouldn't have. We took the first curve too fast. The tires screeched. I fought the wheel, heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. We skidded into the ditch, missing a telephone pole by inches. Daniel threw up on the side of the road while I sat shaking behind the wheel. When I got home, I lied. Said I'd hit a deer. Dad stared at the crumpled fender, jaw tight. He didn't yell. He didn't even look surprised. He just turned and went inside. Grandma Elizabeth had the Lexus towed, repaired, and detailed by the next afternoon like it was a minor inconvenience. No one asked me what had really happened. Things spiraled after that. Grandma kept signing me up for more camps, more programs, more networking opportunities. Business conferences, political youth summits, scholarship panels. My calendar was booked out months in advance. I barely had time to breathe, let alone live. Meanwhile, Mom and Dad became ghosts. We lived in the same house but might as well have been on different planets. Dinners were eaten separately. Conversations were reduced to sticky notes on the fridge. Once, in a desperate attempt to reconnect, I asked Dad if he wanted to come watch me play in the Westbridge Fall concert. I had a solo. He just said, maybe, without looking up from the bills he was sorting. He didn't come. After the concert, Grandma Elizabeth swept in, handing me a bouquet of roses so big I could barely hold them. Grandpa George clapped me on the back like I was a prize-winning horse. I smiled for the cameras, but inside, I was screaming. The letter from Kingswood University came on a Tuesday afternoon, thick and heavy, with a deep green crest stamped on the envelope. My heart almost stopped when I opened it. I had been accepted, full scholarship for academics, but it wouldn't cover housing, books, or fees. The bottom line was clear. I needed help if I wanted to go. Grandma Elizabeth and Grandpa George didn't even hesitate. "We'll cover the rest," Grandpa said, his hand firm on my shoulder. "Consider it an investment," Grandma added, already mentally redecorating my future dorm room. I should have been thrilled. Kingswood was everything I had worked for. Prestige, connections, a foot in the door to a future I could hardly imagine. My friends were excited for me. My guidance counselor cried when she heard. But at home, the air was cold enough to freeze. That night at dinner, I slid the acceptance letter across the table to my parents, my chest tight with hope. Dad barely glanced at it. "Congratulations," he said, his voice flat. Mom nodded, but she didn't smile. She set down her fork slowly, like every movement hurt. "We need to talk," she said. I knew it was bad when she didn't even wait for us to finish eating. We moved into the living room, sat in stiff silence on opposite couches. I clutched the letter in my hands, the paper crinkling under my sweaty fingers. "We're proud of you," Dad started, and that but hung in the air like a noose. "But we don't want you accepting their money," Mom said, cutting straight to the point. I blinked. "What are you talking about?" "We don't want you to owe them any more than you already do," Dad said. His voice was tight, almost shaking. "We've seen what their help costs." I stared at them stunned. "I can't afford Kingswood without them." "Then you don't go," Mom said simply. It felt like someone punched me in the stomach. "You'd rather I throw this away? Everything I've worked for?" "We don't want you trapped," Dad said. "We want you free. But you're the ones putting chains on me," I shot back, my voice rising. "This is my future, not yours." The fight that exploded next was unlike anything we had ever had before. It wasn't just raised voices. It was everything. Every silent resentment from the past few years, every bitter word that had gone unsaid. "You're choosing money over family," Dad shouted. "You stopped being my family the second you turned your backs on me." I screamed back. Mom covered her mouth with her hand, tears streaming down her face. Dad stood there, fists clenching and unclenching like he didn't know what to do with them. Grandma Elizabeth and Grandpa George showed up halfway through the storm. They must have heard the shouting from the driveway. Without a word, Grandma swept me into a hug, and Grandpa planted himself between me and my parents like a human shield. "You've made your choice clear," Grandpa said to Dad, voice like iron. And so has she. That night, I packed my bags. I didn't even know where I was going at first. Just threw everything into 2 duffel bags: clothes, books, my violin, my acceptance letter, and a small box of photographs that I couldn't bear to leave behind. Dad didn't stop me. Mom didn't even come out of the bedroom. I slept at Grandma and Grandpa's that night. Their house, usually so warm and grand, felt like a hospital ward. Bright, cold, sterile. I stared at the ceiling of the guest room, feeling both free and completely hollow. Word got out fast. At school, whispers followed me down the hallways. "Did you hear? Sarah moved out. I heard her parents kicked her out. I heard she sued them." None of it was true, but I didn't have the energy to correct them. Meanwhile, Elizabeth and George moved fast. Within days, they hired a college consultant, a sharp-eyed woman named Diane Morgan, who wore pencil skirts and spoke like every sentence was a command. She arranged everything: my dorm, my classes, even the brand of laptop I should buy. She showed up at the house with folders of paperwork, schedules, timelines. It was like being drafted into an army I never enlisted in. Diane wasn't the only new figure in my life. There was Mr. Chambers, a retired attorney Grandpa hired to advise me. He explained in cool, measured tones that since I was now financially independent, I could legally sever ties with my parents if I wished. I didn't wish. I just wanted to go to college. Still, it was comforting to know I could. I started receiving strange messages around then. Handwritten notes in my locker: "You don't belong here." Crude graffiti in the school bathroom: "Rich whore." Prank calls at night: heavy breathing, silence, hang-ups. At first, I thought it was random cruelty. Teenagers being teenagers. But then my old friend Ellie confessed that someone had paid her $50 to follow me around and report back what I was doing. I confronted her after school, standing by the edge of the football field, the winter wind whipping around us. "Who paid you?" I demanded. Ellie's face crumpled. "Your mom." I felt my legs nearly give out. "You're lying." "I swear to God," she said, crying. "She said she just wanted to make sure you were okay." I walked away before I could say something unforgivable. Spring slid into summer, and the days stretched long and unbearable. At Grandma and Grandpa's house, preparations for college ramped up like a military operation. Meetings with advisors. Shopping trips for designer dorm essentials. Luncheons with alumni. Meanwhile, the gap between me and my parents became a canyon. I sent a card on my mother's birthday. No response. I called on Father's Day, straight to voicemail. Once in a moment of weakness, I drove past the old house. My bedroom window was dark. The porch light was off. For a moment, I wondered if they even lived there anymore, if maybe they had erased me from their lives the way you erase a mistake in pencil. On my last day in town before heading to Kingswood, there was a knock at the door. It was Dad. He stood there, looking older, thinner. He held a cardboard box. "No smile, no hello." "This was yours," he said, shoving the box into my arms. Inside were a few things I hadn't taken. Old trophies, a crumpled photo of us at the lake, the stuffed bear he had won for me at a fair when I was 8. "Goodbye, Sarah," he said. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. He turned and walked away. Grandpa George watched from the porch, his jaw clenched so tight I thought he might shatter his own teeth. "Some wounds," he said, "don't heal." I left for Kingswood the next morning. No goodbye calls. No letters. No last-minute apologies. Just the road ahead, long and empty. I used to believe that the coldness growing between my parents and me was about pride, about the humiliation they must have felt every time my grandparents stepped in to cover a bill or buy me something they couldn't afford, and for a long time, it was easier to blame it on stubbornness than to look any deeper. But sometimes the truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface no matter how deeply it's buried, and when it finally did, it left scars I'm not sure will ever fully heal. It started one rainy afternoon during my second semester at Kingswood University, while I was home for a short spring break. I had been staying with Grandma Elizabeth and Grandpa George, as usual now, spending most of my days buried in applications for summer internships and scholarship renewals, barely paying attention to the world around me, when I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. They were in the sitting room, their voices low but heated, and something about the tension made me stop on the staircase, heart thudding painfully in my chest. "I still can't believe how they treated her after everything we've done," Grandma Elizabeth said, her voice sharp, the words cutting through the thick silence of the house like a knife. "Let it go, Elizabeth," Grandpa George replied, though his voice held that same weary anger. "We gave them everything. It's not our fault they spent it all on themselves." The words hit me like a blow to the stomach. I stood there frozen, gripping the banister so tightly my knuckles turned white, the conversation below continuing as if I wasn't even there. "They could have used that money to fix the roof," Grandma continued. "Or get her braces when she needed them. Or at least make sure she had groceries. Instead, Linda bought a designer purse collection, and Michael treated himself to that damned boat he never learned to sail." My mind raced, flipping through memory after memory. The broken windows Dad never bothered to repair, the nights Mom cried in the kitchen because she didn't know how we'd pay the heating bill, the secondhand clothes, the canceled school trips. None of it made sense anymore. When I finally managed to move, I went back up to my room, closed the door quietly behind me, and sat down hard on the bed. For a long time, I just stared at the wall, feeling like the foundation of everything I knew had started to crumble beneath my feet. Later that night, after Grandma and Grandpa had gone to bed, I crept downstairs into Grandpa's study, heart hammering in my chest, half convinced I'd find nothing and half terrified I would find too much. His filing cabinets weren't even locked. The old keys hung from a hook right on his desk, almost as if daring me to open the drawers and see for myself. I found the file within minutes. It was labeled Family Support in Grandpa's meticulous handwriting, thick and bulging with documents. I pulled it out and sat cross-legged on the floor, unfolding paper after paper with trembling hands. There were copies of checks written out to my parents, monthly amounts, steadily increasing over the years, sometimes small, sometimes huge. Alongside them were printed receipts, bank transfer confirmations, and detailed notes in Grandma's sharp script: mortgage payment March, emergency dental surgery for Sarah, roof repair deposit. But that wasn't all. Buried toward the bottom of the folder, there were copies of different kinds of expenses, luxury purchases that had nothing to do with our family's supposed hardships, a $5,000 invoice from an exclusive resort in Mexico, an itemized bill from a high-end jewelry store, listing a diamond tennis bracelet and a pair of emerald earrings, a receipt for a private golf club membership, and another for the boat marina rental, the same boat Dad used to joke about but that I had never once seen him actually use. Each piece of evidence twisted the knife a little deeper. I sat there until the sun came up, numb and hollowed out, my entire childhood rearranging itself into something uglier, something I didn't know how to live with. The next day, needing more proof, more confirmation that I wasn't simply misinterpreting documents in a sleep-deprived haze, I decided to do something desperate. I called Mrs. Pritchard, our old neighbor, who had lived next to us for as long as I could remember, and who had always been just nosy enough to know everyone's secrets. She agreed to meet me at a little coffee shop downtown, raising one eyebrow when she saw the grim expression on my face. Over lukewarm coffee and stale pastries, I asked her, as casually as I could, if she remembered anything unusual about my parents back when I was growing up. Mrs. Pritchard didn't even hesitate. She leaned in, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Your mama used to get packages from Saks Fifth Avenue every other week," she said, stirring her coffee with exaggerated slowness. "Clothes, shoes, handbags, you name it. I always wondered how they could afford it with Michael's job at the garage and all." I stared at her, my throat dry. "Did you ever see the boat?" "Oh sure," she said brightly. "They had that thing for years. Kept it down at Clearwater Marina. Your daddy used to take his friends out fishing." "Never invited you, did he?" I shook my head, bell rising in my throat. Mrs. Pritchard patted my hand sympathetically. "Sometimes people got their priorities all wrong, sugar. It ain't your fault." I thanked her and stumbled out into the street, the bright spring sunlight feeling like an insult against the heavy weight pressing down on my chest. Over the next few days, I kept digging. At the town hall, I pulled up property tax records and found that Dad had refinanced the house 3 separate times, each time pulling out tens of thousands of dollars in equity that somehow never translated into home repairs. At the bank, after some clever convincing, I managed to get a glimpse at some of the old wire transfers, direct payments from Grandpa's accounts into theirs. And still at home, in the memories stitched into every corner of my mind, there was that sense of lack, that constant background noise of "we can't afford it, not this year, maybe when things get better." I started to wonder if I had ever truly known my parents at all. When I finally confronted them, it was not with anger, but with exhaustion. I asked them to meet me at a neutral place, a quiet, almost empty diner on the edge of town where nobody would overhear us. They showed up late, both looking defensive and tired, and slid into the booth across from me without so much as a greeting. I placed the stack of documents on the table between us and looked them in the eye. "I know everything," I said, voice steady. "I know about the checks, the gifts, the boat, the trips. I know you took their money for years and lied to me about it." Dad flinched slightly. Mom opened her mouth as if to deny it, but the evidence sat there, undeniable, damning. "We deserve something for ourselves." Mom burst out after a long silence, slamming her hand on the table hard enough to make the salt shaker jump. "We spent our lives working and scraping by, and they treated us like children, always reminding us we weren't good enough. So you stole from them," I said quietly. "We didn't steal," Dad said through gritted teeth. "They gave it willingly." "But you lied," I said. "To them. To me. You let me think we were struggling. You made me feel guilty for every single thing I needed, while you were blowing their money on golf clubs and cruises." Dad's face darkened. "You think you're so much better than us now, don't you?" "I don't know what I am anymore," I said honestly. The conversation dissolved into shouting, accusations flying across the cheap linoleum table until the waitress started hovering nearby nervously. In the end, Mom stormed out in tears, and Dad followed without another word. I stayed there for a long time afterward, stirring my untouched coffee, trying to remember when exactly everything had gone so wrong. There was no dramatic ending to it, no final showdown where anyone apologized or begged for forgiveness. They simply stopped calling, stopped sending cards, stopped pretending. The next time I visited my grandparents, I found a new stack of paperwork waiting for me. Trust documents, legal forms, protections against the kind of betrayal I had never seen coming. As I signed my name, Page after page, I realized something brutal and cold had snapped into place inside me, a realization that family could be a choice, and sometimes the people who raised you were the ones you had to leave behind to survive. And somehow, in the empty, echoing quiet that followed, I felt freer than I ever had before. It's a strange thing, watching people you once trusted turn into your enemies in real time. It doesn't happen all at once, not with screaming matches or slammed doors, but slowly, insidiously, like a leak in the foundation that you don't notice until the whole house collapses. At first, I thought the silence from my parents after our confrontation at the diner meant they were finally going to leave me alone. I imagined they were embarrassed, maybe angry, but at least retreating. I was wrong. So horribly, disastrously wrong. It began subtly, almost innocently. One evening, as I sat in the library at Kingswood, hunched over a pile of books, my phone buzzed with a notification. A friend from my old town, Jessica Holloway, had sent me a screenshot. It was a Facebook post from my mother. "Some people you love turn out to be the worst kind of betrayers," it read. "They take everything you give them and then stab you in the back. Beware of wolves in sheep's clothing." I stared at it numb. Surely it couldn't be about me, I thought. Surely she wouldn't make something so public. But the comments beneath it told a different story. "So sorry you're going through this, Linda," one person wrote. "Kids these days have no respect," another chimed in. There were dozens of likes, comments, hearts, people piling on without knowing a thing about what had really happened. I sat there, heart pounding in my ears, as another message from Jessica came through. "They're saying you scammed them," she wrote. "That you lied to get their money." I didn't even remember getting up, but somehow I found myself outside, the sharp March wind cutting through my jacket as I scrolled through dozens of posts, one after another. Mom. Dad. Even some of their friends and cousins I barely knew, sharing vague but pointed rants about ungrateful children, manipulators, thieves. They never mentioned my name directly, but they didn't have to. Everyone knew who they were talking about. And then it got worse. They started telling outright lies. Saying I had cheated on exams at Westbridge, that I had bullied other students, that I had used emotional manipulation to get money from my elderly grandparents. They twisted every achievement, every moment of pride, into something shameful. People I hadn't spoken to in years started messaging me, some offering condolences, some demanding explanations, some just reveling in the drama. I deleted my Facebook account that night. It felt like cutting off a limb, but I couldn't stand to see my name dragged through the mud any longer. But social media is a hydra. Cut off one head, two more grow back. They spread the lies to Instagram, to Twitter, to private neighborhood Facebook groups. They shared screenshots of old family photos with captions like, "Look what we lost." They posted old report cards with vague, snide comments about cheating the system. They weaponized every scrap of my childhood against me. The final straw came 2 weeks later, when I received an email from Kingswood's Academic Integrity Board. Someone had anonymously reported me for academic misconduct. I knew exactly who it was, though the report was ultimately dismissed. Because, of course, there was no evidence. The damage was done. Professors looked at me differently. My classmates whispered when I walked by. One particularly cruel girl in my economics seminar, Heather Vance, cornered me after class and said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Maybe money can buy you a degree, but it can't buy respect." I didn't answer. I just walked past her, my cheeks burning with shame and rage. That night, I sat on the floor of my dorm room, staring at the wall, feeling like the walls were closing in. I realized then that this wouldn't stop on its own. They were not going to wake up one morning, realize they had gone too far and apologize. They were going to destroy me if I let them. I needed protection. I needed to fight back. I contacted Grandpa George and told him everything. He was silent for a long moment after I finished, then said, "It's time we brought in the big guns." The next morning, I had my first meeting with Olivia Carter, a lawyer recommended by one of Grandpa's business contacts. Olivia was in her late 30s, with sharp eyes, a no-nonsense tone, and a reputation for handling messy family disputes discreetly and viciously when necessary. She listened carefully, taking notes as I recounted everything. The social media posts, the false accusations, the report to the university. "They're committing defamation," she said when I finished. "We can send a cease and desist immediately. If they don't back off, we sue." The words sounded cold, heavy, permanent. But they also sounded like hope. We moved fast. Olivia drafted a formal letter that was hand-delivered to my parents' house. The language was brutal, all references to defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, punitive damages. Within hours, the vague posts disappeared. Their profiles went private. Some of their friends and flying monkeys followed suit. But it wasn't enough for me anymore. I blocked them. On everything. Facebook, Instagram, email, even their phone numbers. I blocked their friends, their cousins, anyone who might try to sneak their poison back into my life. I moved out of the dorms into a small off-campus apartment funded by my grandparents. I changed my phone number. I even got a new part-time job at a coffee shop 20 minutes away under a different name tag, just in case. It felt like cutting off a piece of myself, severing something that once defined me. But it was also the first time in years I could breathe without feeling like I was about to drown. There were still setbacks. One night, someone smashed the windshield of my Lexus. A week later, someone spray-painted "liar" across the door of the coffee shop where I worked. No one ever proved who did it, but I didn't need a confession to know. Kingswood Security got involved after that, offering me escorts to and from my classes for a few weeks. Olivia filed police reports. My grandparents installed cameras around my apartment and hired a private security firm, Pendrake Protective Services, to check on me periodically. I lived like a ghost. Careful. Quiet. Watching my back. There were moments I nearly crumbled. Birthdays came and went with no cards, no calls. Christmas passed with a hollow ache where family warmth used to be. Some nights I would wake up from dreams where Dad was laughing, Mom was humming in the kitchen, only to open my eyes and remember the cold reality. But other moments were better. Stronger. I made real friends. People who liked me for who I was, not who my family pretended I should be. I built a future that was mine, messy and imperfect and honest. And as for my parents, they faded into the background like a bad memory, a warning rather than a wound. I didn't need them anymore. I had survived, and I would never let them near me again. After everything that had happened, after every cruel word, every lie they had spread about me, a part of me honestly thought I would never hear about my parents again. They had made their choice to burn bridges, and I had made mine to walk away. I imagined their lives carrying on without me, stubborn and proud, as if nothing had changed. But the truth had a way of dragging itself into the light, no matter how deeply you tried to bury it. And when it came hard. It was Ava Carson who first told me. Ava had been one of those people who floated around the edges of my life growing up, a distant friend of the family, the kind of person who was always at backyard barbecues and birthday parties, never close enough to trust, but close enough to know things. She messaged me out of the blue one Friday afternoon while I was in the library at Kingswood, desperately trying to finish a term paper I had no emotional energy for. "Hey Sarah," the message read. "Not sure if you've heard, but your parents are selling the house." At first, I just stared at the screen confused. Selling the house? That didn't make sense. They had lived in that house my entire life. Dad always said he'd die there, that it was the only piece of dignity he had left. Selling it seemed unimaginable. Still, curiosity gnawed at me until I couldn't ignore it. I called up a real estate site, typed in the old address, and there it was, 57 Maple Hollow Lane, listed for sale. Asking price, $599,000. I sat back in my chair stunned. But that was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, more pieces of the story started to trickle in, whispered by old neighbors, pieced together from social media posts and local gossip. The truth, once it fully surfaced, was almost too pathetic to believe. Michael and Linda were bankrupt. Not just struggling to pay bills bankrupt, not just cutting back on Starbucks bankrupt, but full-on, court-ordered, creditors circling, repossession notices taped to the front door bankrupt. Apparently, after cutting ties with my grandparents and me, they had tried to maintain the same lifestyle they had enjoyed when the secret money was still flowing. Designer clothes, lavish vacations, private club memberships. Only now, there was no extra cash padding their accounts. No anonymous gifts arriving every month. No one left to bail them out. Dad had sunk tens of thousands into a doomed investment opportunity with a man named Ronnie Keene, a former coworker turned entrepreneur who promised he could turn garage repair skills into a chain of luxury auto boutiques. Instead, Ronnie skipped town with the money, leaving Dad holding the bag and a pile of fraudulent contracts. Mom, meanwhile, had taken out private loans in her name to cover their mounting bills. High-interest loans from companies with names like Easy Finance and Quick Money Pro, the kind of lenders who didn't care about your credit score but would eat you alive with fees. By the time the house went on the market, foreclosure papers were already being processed. Ava, who had a cousin in the town clerk's office, filled me in on even more of the gory details. Unpaid property taxes. Lawsuits from credit card companies. A judgment lien from a jewelry store where Mom had apparently tried to finance a new set of diamond earrings less than 6 months after our final blowout. They were drowning. When the house finally sold, for significantly less than the original asking price, after multiple desperate price cuts, Michael and Linda were forced to vacate within 30 days. There were photos, circulated gleefully by certain town busybodies, of them hauling battered cardboard boxes into an aging U-Haul truck, faces hidden behind dark sunglasses, looking like fugitives rather than homeowners. They moved into a small, crumbling duplex on the south side of town, the kind of place where the paint peeled off the walls and the neighbors shouted at each other through thin drywall at all hours. No backyard. No white picket fence. No boat in the driveway. Gone was the life they had built on lies and stolen generosity. I wish I could say I felt satisfaction when I heard all this. I wish I could say I laughed, or that I felt some righteous sense of justice. But mostly, what I felt was a sick, heavy sadness. Not for them exactly, but for everything that had been wasted. For all the things they could have had if they hadn't let pride and greed rot them from the inside out. Still, even as I wrestled with those feelings, more details kept emerging, each one more pathetic and ugly than the last. I learned that Dad had tried to start a handyman business from their new duplex, printing flyers and offering to fix leaky faucets and broken windows for cash under the table. According to Ava, who heard it from a mutual acquaintance, he was practically laughed out of the nicer neighborhoods when he showed up driving a battered old van with duct tape holding the side mirror on. Mom, desperate to maintain some sense of superiority, took a job at a local boutique, not as a manager, not even as a cashier, but folding clothes in the back room. She told everyone it was temporary, that she was just helping out a friend, but everyone knew the truth. Their social circle, once wide and glittering, evaporated overnight. The country club revoked their membership. Their old friends stopped returning calls. Even the pastor of their church started gently steering them toward outreach ministries for families in transition, a polite way of saying charity cases. Meanwhile, their bitterness only grew. Somehow in their minds, all of this was still my fault. Friends sent me screenshots of more posts, new ones, posted under fake accounts, or whispered through sock puppet pages, still clinging to the narrative that I had robbed them, betrayed them, destroyed the family. It would have been almost laughable if it weren't so pathetic. There was even a rumor, when I heard secondhand through a former classmate named Jordan Wills, that mom had started telling people I wasn't really their biological daughter, that I was adopted, taken in out of pity, and that now I had turned on them like a snake. Jordan apologized for telling me, said he didn't even believe it, but I was glad he did. It confirmed what I already knew, that there was no bottom to how low they would sink. I didn't respond. I didn't retaliate. I didn't even acknowledge it publicly. Instead, I lived. I threw myself into my studies, graduated from Kingswood with honors, and accepted an offer from a prestigious consulting firm in the city. I built a life, a real life, one with friends who loved me for who I was, mentors who encouraged me, dreams that belonged entirely to me. And I never once looked back. They were ghosts now. Bitter, angry ghosts, trapped in the ruins of their own making. And I finally was free. When I left everything behind, it wasn't just a physical move. It was like shedding an entire skin, abandoning a version of myself that had been molded by years of guilt, manipulation, and betrayal. I knew I couldn't stay in the small town where every corner held a bad memory, and every whispered conversation reminded me of everything that had gone wrong. I needed a clean break, a real beginning. And so, when I packed my things and booked a one-way ticket to Chicago, it wasn't just geography that changed. It was everything. Chicago was overwhelming at first, a brutal city of glass and steel and noise that didn't care about my small-town history or the baggage I dragged behind me. I found a cramped studio apartment in Old Town, with peeling paint on the windowsills and a heater that rattled like a broken engine. But it was mine. It was freedom, raw and electric, humming under my skin every time I turned the key in the door. I threw myself into law school at Northwestern with a ferocity I hadn't known I possessed. Gone were the days of tiptoeing around other people's expectations. Now there was only the grind. Late nights fueled by cheap coffee and ambition, mornings spent buried in case law and procedural texts, weekends sacrificed to endless internships that barely paid for groceries. But it wasn't just about survival. I was good at it. I was better than good. The law clicked in my brain like pieces of a puzzle finally snapping together. I understood the logic, the strategy, the precision of it in a way that felt almost physical. While other students stumbled through mock trials, I dissected arguments with ruthless efficiency. Professor Ellis, an intimidating woman with a reputation for eating first-year students alive, pulled me aside after my first oral argument. "You have the instincts of a shark," she said, tapping her pen against her clipboard. "You're going to make a lot of enemies. That's how you'll know you're doing it right." It wasn't just empty praise. Opportunities started rolling in faster than I could grab them. I clerked for Judge Karen Alvarez, one of the youngest and most feared federal judges in Chicago, a woman known for her no-nonsense rulings and icy demeanor. Working under her was like training under a drill sergeant, but it honed me into something harder, sharper. During my final year, I landed a coveted summer associate position at Barrett Crane, one of the top litigation firms in the city. The partners, hard-faced men in bespoke suits and women who could destroy reputations with a single well-placed remark, tested me relentlessly, throwing me into depositions, hearings, even second-chairing small trials. Every win was a battle scar, every late-night drafting sessions, a step closer to something I could finally call my own. And yet, through it all, I carried the memory of my grandparents like a heartbeat under my ribs. Without Elizabeth and George, none of this would have been possible. It haunted me, sometimes, the thought of everything they had sacrificed while I had moved further and further from the little girl they had once tried so desperately to protect. After passing the bar, top of my class, crushing the exam like it had personally insulted me, I accepted a full-time position at Barrett Crane. It felt surreal, walking into those gleaming offices on LaSalle Street, the city sprawling out beneath me, and knowing I had built it all myself. Still, success alone wasn't enough. I needed to do something that would honor the people who had believed in me when no one else would. The idea came one rainy Sunday afternoon when I was sitting at a coffee shop in Wicker Park, flipping through a newspaper. Buried between articles about political scandals and sports scores was a tiny piece about a local philanthropist setting up a scholarship fund for underprivileged students. It hit me like a lightning bolt. I couldn't change what had happened. I couldn't erase the betrayals or rewrite the past, but I could build something better for someone else. I could make sure other kids without safety nets, kids caught between broken families, had a fighting chance. It took months of planning, late nights poring over contracts and endowment paperwork, endless meetings with accountants and financial advisors. I wanted it to be perfect. No half measures. No flashy gestures designed to grab headlines and fade away in a year. Finally, after endless red tape and logistical nightmares, the Elizabeth and George Marwick Scholarship Fund was born, a $500,000 endowment aimed at supporting first-generation college students with full tuition, housing stipends, and a mentorship program staffed by volunteer attorneys, professors, and business leaders. The launch event was small, tasteful, exactly the way Grandma would have wanted. I rented out a modest hall in the Harold Washington Library Center and invited only a handful of trusted friends, colleagues, and a few of the first recipients, kids who reminded me so much of myself it hurt to look at them. There was Emma Reyes, a fierce-eyed girl who had clawed her way out of a foster care system that tried to chew her up and spit her out. Jamal Carter, who worked 2 jobs to support his little brothers while finishing high school with honors. Priya Nair, who had taught herself calculus from library books because her school didn't offer AP courses. They spoke at the podium in halting, nervous voices, clutching their award certificates like lifelines. I watched from the back of the room, heart in my throat, as their families cried, as their dreams finally seemed possible. When it was my turn to speak, I nearly choked on the words. I wouldn't be here without 2 people who believed in me when no one else would, I said, my voice shaking despite all my courtroom training. This is for them. And for every kid who's ever been told they aren't enough. Afterward, as the crowd mingled, Emma hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. You changed my life, she whispered. I squeezed her back and thought, no, you saved mine. The scholarship quickly gained traction. Local papers picked up the story. Alumni groups at Northwestern and Kingswood praised it as a model for sustainable student aid. Donations started trickling in, small at first, then bigger, until it became clear that the fund might one day double, even triple in size. Offers came too, to sit on panels, to speak at conferences, to join boards. I accepted some, declined others. I wasn't interested in being a figurehead or a mascot. I just wanted to keep building something real. Meanwhile, life in Chicago settled into a rhythm I had only ever dreamed of. My apartment improved. I upgraded to a 2-bedroom loft in the West Loop, all exposed brick and gleaming wood floors. I adopted a ridiculous Labrador puppy named Milo, who shredded 3 couches before finally learning to behave. I met friends who became family, people like Tara Lynn, a whip-smart immigration attorney who taught me how to drink whiskey properly, and Marcus Dell, a financial analyst with a sharp sense of humor and a heart too big for his chest. We built our own traditions, Sunday brunches that turned into all-day affairs, board game nights that devolved into shouting matches over Monopoly, camping trips that usually ended in disaster but still made for the best stories. Sometimes late at night, I would sit by my window, looking out over the skyline, and wonder what Elizabeth and George would think if they could see me now. I hoped they would be proud. I knew they would be proud. And for the first time in a very, very long time, that was enough. When the call came that morning, it was barely light outside, the sky a heavy iron gray above the rooftops of Chicago, and somehow, before I even answered the phone, I knew it would be bad news. It was Dr. Patel from Mercy Hill Hospital, her voice quiet and too careful as she told me that Grandpa George had passed away peacefully in his sleep sometime around 3 a.m., and even though I had known this day was coming, even though every visit over the past year had been shadowed by the knowledge that each one could be the last, I still sat there on the edge of my bed, the cold from the floorboards biting into my feet, and felt like I had been kicked in the chest so hard I couldn't breathe. I don't remember the rest of that day, not really. It passed in a strange, muted haze, phone calls made and funeral homes contacted, flights arranged for out-of-town relatives I barely knew, and through it all, this suffocating grief hanging over me, heavier than any weight I had ever carried before. 2 days later, before I had even begun to wrap my head around the fact that Grandpa was truly gone, the second call came. Grandma Elizabeth had suffered a massive stroke during the night and had died before the paramedics could even get her to the hospital, and when Dr. Patel told me this, her voice even softer this time, all I could do was nod numbly, as if I could somehow agree with death itself and make it easier to bear. Their funerals were held back to back, a grim double feature that left me hollowed out and shaking by the end of it, and though the church was packed, I hardly registered the faces around me until I caught sight of 2 familiar figures lingering near the back, Michael and Linda, my parents, dressed in black, faces pinched and grim, and I knew without needing to be told why they had come. It wasn't grief that had dragged them here, wasn't guilt or regret or even respect. It was the hope that, somehow despite everything, despite the years of betrayal and lawsuits and court orders, they might still worm their way back into whatever was left behind. But they were in for a rude awakening. Grandpa George and Grandma Elizabeth, meticulous to the very end, had spent years ensuring that their estate would be locked up tighter than Fort Knox against any challenge, with dozens of video testimonies, notarized documents, medical evaluations affirming their mental competency, and a will drafted and defended by Veronica Steele, a woman so ruthless in her legal career that even hardened criminals were said to think twice before crossing her. When Veronica convened the family for the reading of the will, it was held in a sterile, windowless conference room downtown, 2 security guards posted outside just in case, and as I sat there, flanked by Olivia Carter, my own lawyer and by now a trusted friend, I watched Michael and Linda fidget and glower from across the polished table, knowing deep down they already suspected what was coming but still too arrogant to believe it could actually happen to them. The will was simple and devastating in its finality. Every asset, every account, every property, every piece of what Elizabeth and George had built over a lifetime was left solely to me. There were small donations allocated to charities they had long supported, a few modest gifts for old friends and loyal staff, but the heart of the estate, the sprawling Victorian home, the trust funds, the investment portfolios, all of it was mine. There was a specific clause addressing Michael and Linda by name, stating clearly that, due to repeated financial abuse, breach of trust, and demonstrated hostility towards the beneficiaries. No inheritance shall be granted. And the room went so silent after those words were read that I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Linda burst into noisy gasping sobs that echoed off the conference room walls while Michael clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white, and though they hissed threats about contesting the will, about dragging the whole thing through the courts, Veronica simply smiled, a slow, cold smile, and handed them each a copy of the documentation, pointing out in detail every safeguard, every trap they would trigger if they so much as tried. In the end, there was nothing they could do but slink away, smaller and more broken than I had ever seen them, leaving me sitting there in stunned, exhausted triumph. For the first time in my life, they had no power over me. Over the next year, I set about building the life I had once only dared to dream about. I used part of the inheritance to expand the Elizabeth and George Marwick Foundation, doubling the scholarship fund, creating internship programs, mentorship networks, emergency grants for students at risk of dropping out, and watching it grow into something that would touch hundreds, maybe thousands of lives. Something real and good and lasting in a way that money stuffed into bank accounts never could. I bought a brownstone in Lincoln Park. Not a flashy modern penthouse, but an old, slightly creaky place with ivy climbing the brick walls and a backyard just big enough to plant a small garden. The kind of house that felt like it had a soul, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to breathe deeply without the constant fear of the past clawing its way back. And somewhere in the middle of all of that rebuilding, of finding myself again without the weight of old wounds dragging me down, I found Daniel Vega, a public defender who carried his own scars but wore them like badges of honor rather than chains. We met at a fundraiser for legal aid, both of us bidding, half-jokingly, on a ridiculous oil painting of a bulldog in a judge's wig. And by the time we realized we were bidding against each other, we were laughing so hard that everyone else at the auction stared at us like we had lost our minds. Daniel didn't flinch when I told him about my past, about the betrayals and lawsuits and all the ugly history that sometimes still woke me up in the middle of the night. He didn't try to fix it or minimize it, he just listened, held my hand, and told me with fierce conviction, "You're not your past, Sarah. You're what you survived." We married in a small ceremony in the garden of my brownstone, surrounded by the people who had become my real family, Olivia and Veronica and Marcus and Tara and all the others who had stood by me through the rebuilding, who had seen every broken piece and loved me not in spite of it, but because of it. And when I walked down that makeshift aisle, barefoot in the grass, the late afternoon sun painting everything gold, I thought for a moment I could almost feel Elizabeth and George there with me, their hands steadying me, their voices whispering, "You made it." A year later, Daniel and I welcomed our daughter, Grace Elizabeth Vega, into the world, and when I held her for the first time, her tiny hand curling around my finger with a grip far stronger than I expected, I felt something inside me knit itself back together, something that had been broken for so long, I hadn't even realized how badly I needed it to heal. We built a life filled with laughter and chaos and quiet moments of joy that I never once took for granted. Lazy Sundays reading books on the couch, spontaneous dance parties in the kitchen with Grace giggling uncontrollably, camping trips that always went disastrously wrong but still left us grinning for days afterward. And every single morning, I woke up grateful, fiercely, stubbornly grateful for the second chance I had been given, for the life that had grown out of the ashes of everything I had lost. Elizabeth and George were gone, yes, but their legacy lived on. In the students their scholarships lifted up, in the home filled with love and laughter, in the family I had built piece by piece, scar by scar, hope by hope. And in the quiet golden hours of the early morning, when the world was still and Daniel's arm was draped across me and Grace's soft breathing filled the room like a lullaby, I finally found the thing I had spent a lifetime searching for. I found peace.